In the early 1600s in America, Negroes lifted up their eyes and they found themselves slowly falling into the sunken place. Now, this fall into black consciousness was not by any stretch of the imagination some simple accident, but rather it was the product of a very calculated process, the process of creating a people for the purpose of being permanent residents in the pits of slavery. And so for us to get more detail on this fall, we're going to go into this book right here called Race in North America by the late Dr. Audrey Smedley, who was a social anthropologist and a grand master on race. And so let's open up the book right here to page 98 and follow along on the journey where she says this. There is a tradition in American history that rightly connects race and racism with slavery and thus focuses on the relationship between the two peoples who were most entangled in that institution, Africans and Europeans. The inerrancy of a historical linkage between slavery and racism in North America has to be recognized, although, as we shall see later, there is no intrinsic relationship between the two institutions, meaning that slavery and racism were part of one system in North America, but slavery can and has been practiced without racism. And on the other hand, racism can and has been practiced without slavery. And just because one is practiced, it doesn't mean that the other one is going to follow as a result of that. And that's why she's writing that there is no inherent or intrinsic relationship between these two institutions. They can be practiced separately or combined as they were in North America. And so she continues writing this. Nevertheless, much of the historiography of the 20th century has centered on the issue of which came first, racism or slavery. One school of thought has argued that it was the slave condition itself, especially the debased status of the slave, combined with the physical differences in the population of the masters and slaves, that generated the negative attitudes of racism and subsequent social discrimination. So this school of thought believes that the condition of slavery, with the master having physical differences than that of the slaves, is what caused the practice of racism and discrimination to rise into the society. Let's continue. Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the earliest external chroniclers of the American experience, observed in the 1830s that slavery had given birth to what he saw as a movable prejudice against the Negro. He was followed in this view by most historians of the slave period. The implication of this position, not always apparent to scholars, was that without slavery, race and racism might not have occurred. So that was the first school of thought which declared racism to be a product of American slavery. And understand that this is an attempt to explain the cultural and the psychological attitudes and the circumstances that caused the Negro to fall into the pit, right? And so let's go on to the next explanation, which says this. Another school of thought holds that a kind of racial antagonism was present from the beginning of English contact with Africans, and the institutionalization of racial discrimination, including the separation of blacks and whites, both spatially and socially, preceded the establishment of slavery. Now here we go. This initial English contact had taken place in the 1500s. And that's when the English first actually made contact with the people of Western Africa. And before then, they were only introduced to the West Africans through fairy tales and exaggerated travelers' accounts, right? Some of these accounts were describing the people as being very black, having no law or religion, and living like beasts. And so they were exaggerating the description of the people, and they were ignorant to how the people actually functioned in that society. And so these were the accounts that were widely spread throughout England, right? And they were shaping the mindset of the English before they had even encountered these people in person. And so when they did finally encounter the people, they were already primed with particular attitudes and views about them. And so this other school of thought is saying that the English racism, it was already present at the beginning and before slavery. And so let's get some more. The arguments on both sides are compelling and can be illustrated by the works of several scholars. In the late 1950s, Carl Degler raised the question of causal priorities again and proceeded to suggest evidence that in all of the English colonies, discrimination against the Negro preceded the evolution of a slave status, and by that fact helped to shape the form that institution would assume. The institution of slavery, he argued, came to mirror the discrimination that had occurred from the first contact with Africans on American soil, and in so doing, perpetuated it. And so Carl Degler proposed that the prejudices of the English were first, and then slavery became a reflection of those prejudices. And so what this is doing is trying to get an understanding of the cause. What's the mindset? What were the circumstances that made the Negro fall into the pit? What was it that pulled the Negro down, right? Before we get into the tactics and the strategies that the English implemented to actually do the pulling down, right? So we're getting into the mindset right now and trying to understand the backstory of it, right? So pay attention and let's continue going. Likewise, Arnold Seyle argued that discrimination against the Negro occurred before the slave status was fully defined and before Negro labor became pivotal to the economic system. Somewhat later, Winthrop Jordan offered an expanded version of this view. He attempted to explain or rationalize English attitudes and behaviors towards Africans by suggesting that the very blackness of Negroes was, on first contact, sufficiently traumatic to ensure the development of bias towards them. And just a reminder, the Negro skin color is not and never was black. Black was the color that Europeans used to describe people on the African continent. And so in Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan's book, White Over Black, American Attitudes Towards the Negro, 1550 to 1812, he states in that book that black was an exaggerated term, right? Which it clearly is. And you can still hear people use this term black in a very exaggerated way today, right? Where it's supposed to mean a person who has very rich brown skin, right? And you'll see people use it in the sense of saying someone is so black, right? They're using that in a derogatory way.
Father would tease you about your
Yes, he would tell me I'm ugly.
Your father would say
Yes,
that.
he would.
And Jeff would tell me, oh, you're so black, or you have such a big nose.
He told you you were black?
Yes, when I was little. You are so black. You don't look like my child. Your nose is so big and this and that. They used to call me Big Nose and stuff.
And when people talk like this, all they're doing is perpetuating ideas that originated in the mind of European explorers and conquerors, who likewise, they saw this complexion as a cause of trauma, as Dr. Smedley writes. And so a bias developed around this so-called blackness, as we'll see in just a bit. But she continues and writes this. Their skin color apparently rarely went unnoticed, and he feels that the frequent comments on this characteristic were a measure of the impressions that it made on the English, because they made a lot of comments on it when you read the earlier literature, right? It was something that was seemingly something to obsess over for them. Let's continue. On this feature alone, Africans contrasted strikingly with the English, who were among the lightest skinned peoples of Europe. He speculated that the powerful impact which the Negro's color made upon Englishmen must have been partly owing to suddenness of contact. He added that the English experience with Africans was markedly different from that of the Spanish and Portuguese, who for centuries had been in close contact with North Africans and had actually been invaded and subjected by people both richer and more highly civilized than themselves. And that's referring to the Moors. Now watch this. Jordan saw as the basis of English hostility the fact that the concept of blackness in the English language conveyed predominantly negative images. This is the psychological aspect which has to be considered when we're dealing with this term black, or you won't have the keys to understand how in Western thought being called the name black is linked with negative images. And so this is something that Dr. Winthrop Jordan clearly understood, and he presented in his argument as to how the English developed such attitudes of hostility towards the people that they refer to as Negroes, right? Which means black. Here we go. In this respect, the English language and culture helped to predispose its carriers towards prejudice against Africans. And how did the English language and culture do this? Here it is. On the one hand, black meant filthy, evil, vile, sinister, ugly, fearful, and deadly. That's what the word black meant and means in the English language. And what language is it that you speak? English, right? We're not talking about some ancient Egyptian language or some other African language. We're talking about the English language and Western thought. And in the English language, it means all of those negative ideas that we just heard, which is why when someone hears someone is practicing black magic, people are automatically going to assume that it's something that's dealing with the devil, right? Because these are the ideas that are linked to this word black. Let's continue. It was the color of mourning, emotional partisan color, the handmaid and symbol of baseness and evil, a sign of danger and repulsion. And this was starting in the 1300s, which was well before the English ever set foot on the continent of Africa. And so there are several hundred years of negative images and negative energy that's built up around this term of black. And that energy is super strong. And people try very hard to convince themselves that black is beautiful, black is lit, and black is positive, and it doesn't work that well. And the reason is because there's way too much negative energy that's canceling that out. And so they'll put in all this effort to try to hold on to that identity, and they don't understand that it's working against them. The energy is working against you, especially if you're someone that's trying to climb out of the pit. And so this is black in the English language. Now listen to this. White, on the other hand, was the color of beauty, virtue, purity, goodness, wonder, and perfection. That's what white represents in the English language. All things that are the opposite of black. And it'll be just as pointless to try to turn white in the English language into something completely negative, because likewise, there have been several hundred years of positive energy and positive imagery that has been built up around this term. So both white and black, they're the extreme opposites on the same pole, and they're symbolic of opposition. Let's continue. These contrasting elements in the meaning of these color terms insinuated their way, perhaps subliminally, into English thought and may have become incipient molders of the English attitude towards an evaluation of the Africans. So Dr. Winthrop Jordan placed a lot of emphasis on these colors attributed to these two people as having a major influence on the development of English attitudes. And so Dr. Smedley, she continues writing this. Degler agrees with Jordan that the English had a cultural predisposition derived from values associated with the color black toward a negative view of African people. And so these two scholars were in agreement on that point. And anyone who understands the importance of words and the importance of the meanings of words, they should be able to see how this could have created some type of influence on the attitudes of these people, especially since the name is linked to ideas that trigger strong emotional responses. And so let's continue. He argued from the 1630s up until slavery clearly appeared in the statutes in the 1660s, the Negroes were being set apart and discriminated against as compared with the treatment accorded Englishmen, whether servants or free. So Degler pointed out that Negroes were being singled out for discrimination before it showed up in the law, right? Which makes sense because it must have taken some time for the English colonists to figure out how they were going to deal with these people called Negroes, right? And I believe that they were plotting and they were experimenting for many years before they officially put anything into the law books, right? So let's continue going. Even though the term slave was rarely used, the actual practice, according a distinct and lower status to Negroes, was already in place. For some Negroes, Degler continued, the reality of their servitude already amounted to slavery in that they served for life. And serving for life was just one of the ways that they set the Negro apart from the other lower level English servants in the colonies. They did a whole lot more in the process of creating the Negro consciousness. Here we go. These authors cited examples of white men who were whipped or otherwise penalized in some other way for consorting with Negroes or for lying with a Negro, or they received different sentences for the same crimes. And just who was responsible for the penalties that were imposed upon the English people for consorting or involving themselves with the Negroes? It was the ruling class Englishmen. They were the ones who were shaping and were molding the society. They were the ones who had the knowledge on how to create societies and how to use the laws to create people that think and behave in certain ways. The knowledge on how to influence the way that people interpret their reality. The average English servant, they weren't the ones who had this knowledge. It was the ruling class people who had this knowledge. Just like it was the ruling class Egyptians who had this knowledge. Just like it was the Israelite priests and rulers who had this knowledge. Just like it was the Roman emperors who had this knowledge. Just like it's the dictator Kim Jong-un today who has this knowledge. And so on and so forth. And so to create any type of functioning society, someone or some group of people have to have that knowledge. Now, how they use that knowledge, it varies depending on the character and the goals of the people who are using it. And so the ruling class English people, they set up the society where the Negroes and the English people received different sentences for the same crime. And they did this because this action communicated to the unconscious mind that the Negro is to be looked at by the society as a lower status person, right? They were using that knowledge to condition the consciousness of that society and prepare it for the Negro's complete fall into the bottom of the pit. Let's continue going. They noted that Virginia and Maryland after the mid-17th century passed laws prohibiting Negroes from bearing arms, imposing separate punishment for Negro and white servants, requiring Negroes and Indian women to work in the fields, and taxing Negroes separately. You see that? They started using the laws to shape the environment and to create distinctions between certain members of that society. Now, this wasn't something that the society was raising their hand and voting on and saying that they agree with. These were laws that the ruling class were making up and were passing on their own. Let's continue. There is evidence that lifetime servitude had been imposed on at least some Negroes and their offspring in practice even before the existence of laws permitting it. And so the law just provides us with a record as to when permanent slavery was officially recognized on the books. But it does not tell us when the actual practice began, which Dr. Smedley is saying that there's evidence that it was taking place before it was actually put into law, right? Here we go. And these authors consider the frequent incidences of higher prices paid for Negroes over white servants as evidence of the practice of keeping blacks in servitude for life. Thus, it was not the economic need for slaves alone that explained the inferior social status accorded to Negroes even before slavery was instituted. Other historians have argued that the experiences of the first Africans in North America was never so clear. Their position was in fact somewhat ambiguous. Many feel that there is insufficient evidence in the available sources to declare for certain that all Africans were from the beginning kept separate and apart from the white population. Mary Handlin and Oscar Handlin, among prominent historians, have presented considerable evidence and logical arguments for the position that the first Africans were not slaves. And so Dr. Jacqueline Bateleur, she takes on this position as well. And this is referring to the status of the very earliest Africans that were brought over, which there isn't much hard evidence to determine what their status was. And so people have to fill in the gap of history to the best of their ability, right? Some say they were slaves, others say they were not, right? But let's continue. Slavery, they claim, had no meaning in law. At most, it was a popular description of a low form of service. They point out that Africans were brought into a society where large numbers of people were unfree to some degree, so that the lack of freedom for Africans was not at all unusual. We have already seen that among the many indentured servants in the New World, some of whom were the wild Irish, were other kinds of bonded laborers, including some who were permanent. And this is why we have to understand that those colonial rulers, they would have put anyone in chains, and they did, right? They didn't care about the Irish sharing some physical features with them. They didn't care about that. In fact, the English, they actually hated the Irish, and they would have had no problem using them as slaves if that system would have worked out better for them. But obviously it didn't, right? So she continues writing this. Indian slavery had commenced within a few years of the earlier settlements and the first conflicts with the Pilgrims, and many of these Indians were held for life. Although their numbers were not large, Indian slaves were found throughout the earlier colonies. That they were heathens and had been conquered in a just war was the reason put forth as justification for such treatment. So the Native Americans were on the hit list as well, And if their enslavement would have worked out better and it would have produced a more productive system, then I believe that the English would have had no problem continuing to use them and had no need for the Negro. But that's not how it worked out. Let's continue reading. Because of variations in the condition of bonded servants of European background and in the treatment of Indians, there were many degrees of servitude in the colonies. Not only immigrant servants, bound to a stated number of years of service, but convicts, vagabonds, orphans, illegitimate children of all races, and debtors were frequently bought and sold, and even occasionally referred to as slaves. Jordan's own final analysis obviates or goes around the question of causal primacy. Rather than slavery causing prejudice or vice versa, he avers they seem rather to have generated each other. Both were twin aspects of a general debasement of the Negro. Slavery and prejudice may have been equally cause and effect, continuously reacting upon each other, dynamically joining hands to hustle the Negro down the road to complete degradation. And I think that's a fair observation. He seems to be saying that there was already a prejudice that was brewing in the minds of the English ruling class, and likewise there was also an opportunity germinating for economic gain through the slavery system. And when the English discovered the slavery opportunity, it nurtured their prejudice, which gave justification for that enslavement opportunity. And so as the opportunities advanced, so did the prejudices and the discrimination. And so they were linked hand in hand, right? Each of them fueling each other, fueling the fire, right? Both of them depending on each other. That's how I see Dr. Winthrop D. Jordan viewing it, which I think is reasonable, right? And it makes sense. And so Dr. Audrey Smedley, she continues writing this. The imposition of permanent slavery on Negroes was not the result of a single abrupt decision, as virtually all historians now note. Slavery was an institution only gradually developed. In Virginia, over the critical years between 1660 and 1705, dozens of statutes and regulations were passed restricting some of the rights of blacks, establishing servitude for life, limiting their rights to bear arms and to hold certain property, and providing penalties for interracial marriage or fornication. And what were the ruling class doing? Sitting back and having all types of meetings, discussing a whole bunch of how questions. How can we turn black people into permanent slaves? How can we make the Negro feel inferior? How can we make society view the Negro as less than a human being? How can we make sure that Negroes never rise out of this pit that we're about to dig? How? And they had plenty of time to use their power from within to figure out the answers to these questions, because they weren't the ones that were outside toiling in the field like the majority of the other people were doing. And the answer to these questions during this particular period was to use the legal system to strip away as many rights as possible from the blacks to make them naked in the eyes of the law. Let's continue. Both Virginia and Maryland systematically and step by step enclosed the blacks, both bonded servants and free Negroes, in a tightening vice of legal restriction, the most telling of which were the prohibitions against private manumissions during the 1690s. And what we're seeing right now is a piece of the process that went into the making of the Negro. And so Dr. Audrey Smedley says that they did this step by step in a tightening vice of legal restrictions. Now, do you know what a vice grip is? It's a tool that is used to firmly grip on an object so that object doesn't move. The lawmakers were using the law as a vice to put restraints on the Negro, right? To restrict the Negro from getting out of the pit that they were digging to put the Negro in, right? And so one of the ways that they tightened the vice grip on the Negro was in making it against the law for private slaveholders to free or manumit their slaves, right? Because prior to that, some of the slave masters would free their slaves while they were still alive, and certain others would put it in their will that the slave was free once the owner died. And the ruling class of thinkers, they said, oh no, we can't have this anymore, right? Because this is going against the direction that we are steering the society. And so they used the law and they banned it. Let's continue going. North and South Carolina followed suit in the early decades of the 18th century. Now, for North and South Carolina to follow the footsteps of Virginia and Maryland, somebody must have been in communication. Somebody's talking with somebody. And who do you think these people were that were talking? The ruling class people from each of these colonies. The ones with the knowledge, right? And the rulers in Virginia and Maryland, they must have told the rulers in North and South Carolina, hey, look, this is how we're doing things. These are the results that we're getting in this society. Maybe you should do the same thing. And guess what they did? They did the same thing, right? Let me go back over here to North and South Carolina. Let's write it in our law books too. And that's what they did. Now let's continue. By 1723, the right to vote was ultimately denied to all Negroes in the southern colonies, free as well as slave. So in somebody's mind, the idea must have popped up that the Negro must have no rights to vote at all, right? And this idea was eventually passed on and accepted by all of the people in the southern colonies, right? And they all eventually agreed that their idea of the Negro is someone who's supposed to have no voice in the legal matters within their colonies. And so it started out with an idea, which then progressed into a real law, and then afterwards became a reality, right? And it dragged the Negro a few more steps down into the pit. And so she continues writing this. Little is known about the legal treatment and social position of blacks in New England during the early decades of their presence there. And New England is in the north, and the Negroes were relatively little in number in the New England area at that time. Most of them were in the fields down in the south. And so she writes this. Although both bonded servants, slaves, and free blacks could be found in New England during this time, there were few documented laws or statutes that differentially affected them. Their skin color had seemingly little effect on opportunities to obtain training and employment, rights to police protection, access to justice and the court system, and some level of participation in the political system. Yet in the 1650s, the New England colonies enacted laws prohibiting Indians and Negroes from serving in the militias. So the North jumped in the game as well, but they for sure didn't play it nearly as hard as the Southern colonies did. Let's continue. This was the earliest of a number of legal restrictions affecting blacks and Indians alike. In the 1680s, more regulations of a confining nature applying to Indians, Negroes, mulattoes, servants, and apprentices were enacted. And what other very important event happened in the 1680s? It was the very first time that we get a legal record of the English people referring to themselves as white, right? So at this point, they're really starting to figure out the system of social control that they're trying to put together, right? And they're setting it up and they're creating laws that restrict the people, right? The people who were tagged with these specific types of identities. She continues saying this. These acts seem to reflect a perception of a common identity among these categories of people and a clear intent to exclude them from the privileges and responsibilities enjoyed by Europeans. The major restrictions on Negroes in all of the colonies had been fully implemented by the first decades of the 18th century, when manumission was made more difficult or even impossible. Curfews were imposed and property and marriage regulations were established to separate Negro slaves from free persons and other servants. Although there were far fewer slaves in New England than in the South, and the economic value and need for slavery in this region has been questioned, every colony passed laws defining the Negro as a subordinate and differentiating blacks from other residents. You see that? Defining the Negro as a subordinate. That was coming from their imagination. That was something that they believed, right? And the objective was to get the rest of the society, including the Negro, to believe it too, right? And they were very successful. Very, very successful. And like Dr. Fraser said in his book, Black Bourgeoisie, the Negro came to believe in his own inferiority, meaning that the Negro accepted as true the destructive ideas that came from the minds of the European colonists, including being called a Negro. Do you see that? Now she continues writing this. Nash encapsulated the process of transforming Africans into chattel slavery in a powerful, succinct manner. In rapid succession, Afro-Americans lost their rights to testify before court, to engage in any kind of commercial activity, either as buyer or seller, to hold property, to participate in the political process, to congregate in public places with more than 2 or 3 of their fellows, to travel without permission, and to engage in legal marriage or parenthood. In some colonies, legislature even prohibited the right to education and religion, for they thought these might encourage the germ of freedom in slaves. Gradually, they reduced the slave in the eyes of society and the law from a human being to a piece of chattel property. And that's how the Negro fell into the pit of being a piece of property and a permanent slave. And in later years, particularly in the 17 and 1800s, the whites introduced more advanced psychological warfare to further damage the character, the self-esteem, and the personality of the Negro, right? And all of this was done with the clear intention to create people, a group of people, who were to serve as the permanent members at the bottom of society. And so to climb all the way out of this pit, you have to be just as intentional and deliberate in the shaping of your own mind, with ideas and beliefs which translate into actions and deeds that work for you and not against you. Understand? And so hopefully this has been helpful and has given you some extra light so you can find your way on the path. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.